Jonathan Reed, the newly elected black mayor, found himself walking down streets he hadn't seen in months, but which haunted his thoughts daily. These neighborhoods were the heart of his campaign. His promises to bring change to the forgotten corners of the city were what got him elected. Yet now, as he walked past boarded-up windows, crumbling buildings, and dim streetlights that flickered like dying stars, Jonathan felt the weight of those promises crushing down on him. These weren't just streets, they were symbols of neglect, despair, and broken dreams. His heart sank with each step, and for the first time since taking office, a doubt he hadn't acknowledged started to gnaw at him. He had believed that his election would mark a new era for the city, that he would be the one to turn the tide. But bureaucracy, political infighting, and slow-moving city systems had proven to be greater obstacles than he anticipated. The progress that his reports boasted of seemed, as he now realized, nothing more than an illusion. Deep down he questioned whether real change was even possible. Could he, as one man, really alter the course of a city that had been sinking for decades? Jonathan's gaze swept over the streets, the run-down corner stores, and the empty playgrounds. The sight was enough to send a wave of frustration through him. This is what his administration claimed was improving? A voice in the back of his mind whispered that maybe he was in over his head. Maybe his dreams of transformation were too idealistic, too grand. He stopped in front of a dilapidated apartment building, his eyes tracing the cracks in the walls. There was a hollow ache in his chest. What if he couldn't fix this? Across the street, Officer Michael Carter sat in his patrol car, eyes fixed on the figure of Jonathan Reed, though he didn't know he was yet. To Carter, this man was just another black man walking the streets of a dangerous neighborhood at night. Carter's mind was already working, his biases coloring his perception. He had spent years patrolling these very streets, dealing with the worst the city had to offer, or so he believed. Every day, Carter saw the same faces, the same struggles, and to him, this neighborhood was a war zone. He didn't trust anyone who walked these streets after dark, especially someone who looked like Jonathan. Tonight, Carter was already on edge. Earlier in the evening, there had been reports of an armed robbery and murder a few blocks away. The suspect, described as a tall black man, had reportedly fled into the area, and Carter, with his already ingrained prejudices, was ready to pounce on any potential suspect. When he spotted Jonathan, something in him clicked. He fit the description, at least enough for Carter to justify suspicion, and that's all he needed. From his patrol car, Carter watched Jonathan move through the neighborhood, his gaze narrowing with every step the mayor took. He grabbed his radio and called in to report that he was following a suspicious individual who matched the description from earlier. The dispatcher's voice crackled through the static, advising caution, but Carter was already certain. He had been waiting for something to happen all night, and now he was convinced this was his moment. Jonathan, unaware of the officer tailing him, continued his walk through the neighborhood. He paused by a small park that had once been full of life, now a shadow of its former self. The playground equipment, rusted and broken, stood as a testament to the city's neglect. Jonathan pulled out his phone, typing quick notes about what needed to be addressed. In his mind, he was already formulating plans to bring this neighborhood back to life, but that gnawing doubt remained. Would the system allow him to make real changes? Or would his efforts be drowned in red tape and political roadblocks? As he typed, a faint rustle of movement caught his attention. Looking up, Jonathan spotted Officer Carter approaching, slowly, deliberately. There was something in the officer's posture, his hand resting just a little too close to his holster, that made Jonathan uneasy. Carter wasn't just walking up for a friendly conversation. No, this was something different, something dangerous. Carter didn't approach immediately. He stood a few feet away, pretending to check his phone while keeping Jonathan in his peripheral vision. There was a tension in the air, a brewing storm that neither man could yet fully grasp. Carter's fingers brushed the grip of his gun, a habit he had developed over the years, especially in areas like this. In his mind, Jonathan was no different than the criminals he had spent his career chasing. A black man, walking the streets alone at night in this neighborhood. It didn't matter that Carter had no real evidence. His mind had already made the connection. Jonathan stood up from the bench, ready to continue his walk when Carter finally made his move. He stepped forward, his gaze hard and unyielding. "Evening," Carter said, though there was no warmth in his voice. His eyes flicked up and down, assessing Jonathan as if he were a potential threat. "Evening, officer," Jonathan replied, trying to keep his tone neutral, though he felt a slight unease creeping into his chest. Something about the way the officer was looking at him didn't sit right. "Is there a problem?" Carter tilted his head slightly, his hand resting openly on his holster now. "What are you doing out here?" His tone was more of an accusation than a question. Jonathan, sensing the underlying hostility, took a slow breath before responding. "Just taking a walk, checking on the neighborhood." He could feel the situation teetering, the balance between a simple misunderstanding and something much worse. He didn't want it to escalate, but he could tell by the officer's body language that it already was. "All right," Carter said, his voice thick with disbelief. "You fit the description of someone we're looking for." Find some trouble around here tonight? You mind explaining why you're really out here?" Jonathan felt his heart rate pick up. This wasn't the first time he had been profiled, but something about this encounter felt more dangerous. "I'm Jonathan Reed," he said, keeping his voice calm, though he felt the tension building inside him. "I'm the mayor." Carter's eyes narrowed, his hand now gripping his gun firmly. "Mayor, huh? That's a good one. You got ID to back that up?" Jonathan could sense where this was headed. The officer didn't believe him. It didn't matter what he said, Carter had already decided how Jonathan was, and nothing was going to change his mind. Jonathan moved slowly, reaching for his ID, but as he did, Carter's hand tightened on his gun, ready to draw. "Hands where I can see them," Carter barked, his voice sharp and commanding. "Now." Jonathan froze, his hands raised slowly. His mind raced as the reality of the situation hit him. He was in real danger. Carter didn't see him as a mayor or even as a citizen. He was just another black man in the wrong place at the wrong time. As Jonathan stood with his hands in the air, his mind raced through the growing tension of the situation. He couldn't believe what was happening. Yet the reality was clear. Officer Carter had already decided he was a threat. Jonathan had dealt with this type of profiling before, but never as mayor. The stakes had always been high, but tonight they felt higher than ever. His every movement was now under scrutiny, and the slightest mistake could escalate things beyond control. Carter's eyes were hard and focused, his grip tight around his holster. His mind, meanwhile, was a flurry of activity. The recent reports of an armed robbery and murder were still fresh in his thoughts. A black male suspect, tall and imposing, had fled the scene just a few hours earlier. Though the details were vague, in Carter's mind, Jonathan Reed fit the description too well to be a coincidence. He hadn't seen the man do anything yet, but in Carter's experience, criminals rarely looked guilty before they struck. His pulse quickened as the lines blurred between caution and prejudice. Dispatch had sent out the description of the suspect earlier in the night, and Carter had memorized it. Tall, black male, muscular build, last seen wearing dark clothing. Jonathan matched most of it. To Carter, this wasn't about whether Jonathan was guilty or innocent. It was about ensuring he didn't let a dangerous criminal slip through his fingers. He had been on the force too long, seen too much violence to let his guard down now. Even the hint of a threat was enough to justify his suspicions. Carter's instincts screamed that something was off, that this man, whoever he claimed to be, was trouble. He'd heard too many stories of criminals pretending to be someone else to talk the way out of tight spots. Mayor. Sure, Carter had no intention of letting his guard down. "Keep your hands where I can see them," Carter repeated, his voice as sharp as the night air. He couldn't afford to take chances. Jonathan, maintaining his composure, slowly responded, "I'm reaching for my ID." His voice was calm, though the tension in his muscles betrayed his outward serenity. He understood that in moments like this, perception was everything. One wrong move, one moment of miscommunication, and things could turn deadly. He had seen it happen before to others, heard the stories, felt the anger. But now it was his turn, and he had to navigate it carefully. Carter didn't flinch. His hand stayed on his weapon, ready to pull it at any sign of trouble. Nice and slow, he barked, his eyes never leaving Jonathan. No sudden moves. Jonathan nodded, keeping his movements deliberate as he reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. With a slight tremor in his hand, he held it out toward Carter. "Here's my ID. You can see for yourself I'm Jonathan Reed, the mayor of this city." For a brief moment, Carter hesitated. The Idaho could prove everything or nothing, but his suspicion had already taken hold. In his mind, the title of mayor meant little out here on the streets. He had arrested plenty of people who tried to talk their way out of situations, and he wasn't about to let his guard down now. The man in front of him could very well be the suspect responsible for the robbery and murder earlier that night. The timing was too perfect, and his instincts were telling him this was the man. Instead of taking the ID, Carter knocked another order, dropped the wallet, turned around and faced the wall. Jonathan's confusion turned into frustration. He had done nothing wrong, yet this officer was treating him like a criminal. "Officer, I've told you who I am. If you call this in, you'll see that I'm telling the truth." But Carter wasn't listening. His mind was set. "Turn around," he repeated, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. The safety on his gun clicked off, and the sound sent a chill down Jonathan's spine. The warning was clear: comply or face the consequences. For a moment, Jonathan considered resisting, justifying that he, as the mayor, had the right to demand respect, that this treatment was unjust. A reason prevailed. This wasn't the time for defiance. Too many black men had lost their lives in situations just like this. He had a family to think about, a city to lead. His pride had to take a back seat to survival. Slowly he turned around, facing the brick wall of the rundown building next to him. His hands remained in the air, fingers trembling as the cool night air brushed against his skin. Carter moved in, one hand still on his gun, the other reaching for the cuffs on his belt. He was determined to get this man under control. Every fiber of his being told him this was the right move. A dangerous man was walking the streets, and if he didn't take action now, who knew what could happen? Just as Carter reached for Jonathan's wrists, his radio crackled to life. "All units, be advised, suspect in the earlier robbery spotted near West and 33rd, the dispatcher announced. It was a different location, miles away from where they were. The real suspect had just been spotted. For a brief moment, Carter froze. His hand hovered over Jonathan's wrist, his mind processing the new information. The realization that Jonathan wasn't the man he was after began to sink in, but pride and stubbornness fought to keep him from backing down. He had committed to this course of action, and backing off now would feel like admitting defeat, something he wasn't ready to do. Iwa. Jonathan, who had heard the same dispatch, turned his head slightly. "You heard that, right?" he said, his voice measured but firm. "I'm not your suspect." Carter's jaw clenched. His body stiffened with the weight of his own internal conflict. The dispatcher's call had shifted the narrative, but not enough to erase the fact that, in Carter's eyes, Jonathan was still suspicious. "Doesn't mean you don't have something else to hide," Carter shot back. His grip tightened around Jonathan's wrist as he snapped the cuffs into place. Jonathan's heart sank as the cold metal clamped around his wrists. He had expected this to end differently. A small part of him had hoped that the dispatch would be enough to diffuse the situation, to bring some clarity to the officer, but it hadn't. The officer had made up his mind. Jonathan was being arrested, and the truth of who he was seemed irrelevant. By now, a few curious onlookers had gathered, drawn by the sight of a police officer arresting someone in the middle of the street. Some pulled out their phones, recording the scene. The murmur started, soft at first, but growing louder as people recognized Jonathan. "Isn't that the mayor?" one voice said. "That's him," another replied. "What the hell's going on?" The crowd's whispers only served to fuel Carter's urgency. He didn't like being second-guessed, especially not by civilians who had no idea what it was like to work these streets. He ignored the growing chorus as he finished cuffing Jonathan, yanking him to his feet, with little regard for the fact that this man was, indeed, the mayor. "Let's go," Carter muttered, guiding Jonathan toward the patrol car. He kept his grip firm, refusing to acknowledge the growing tension in the air, but Jonathan could feel it: the stares, the murmurs, the disbelief from the onlookers who knew exactly who he was. This wasn't just another arrest. This was the mayor of their city being treated like a common criminal. As they reached the patrol car, Jonathan's mind raced. How had this spiraled so far out of control? He had come to this neighborhood to observe, to understand the city's problems firsthand, but now here he was in cuffs, being shoved into the back seat of a police car. It felt surreal, like a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. He had always known that being black in America meant walking a fine line, even as a mayor. But tonight, the reality had slapped him in the face with brutal clarity. Carter slammed the door shut and made his way to the driver's seat. His hands trembled slightly, the adrenaline from the confrontation still coursing through him. For a moment, he glanced at Jonathan through the rearview mirror, a flicker of doubt passing through his mind, but he pushed it down, refusing to second-guess himself. He had done what he thought was right, and that was all that mattered. As the car pulled away from the curb, Jonathan sat in silence, his mind replaying the events of the night. His frustration simmered beneath the surface, but more than anything, a deep sadness settled over him. He had fought so hard to bring change to this city, to be the kind of leader that it could look up to. But in the eyes of one officer, none of that mattered. The ride to the precinct felt longer than it should have. Jonathan sat in the back of the patrol car, his wrists painfully bound by the cold metal cuffs, pressing into his skin every time the car hit a bump or made a sharp turn. The windows were dark, but through the smudged glass, he could see glimpses of the city he was supposed to be leading, the city that had elected him to be its change maker. Now he felt as though he had been stripped of all power, reduced to nothing more than another black man in handcuffs. The cruel irony gnawed at him. No amount of authority, no title, could protect him from the deep-seated biases of a system he had vowed to change. Officer Michael Carter, sitting behind the wheel, kept his gaze fixed on the road, his jaw clenched in frustration. His mind was racing. He had arrested dozens of men in his career, but this one was different. The man in his backseat wasn't just any suspect, he was the mayor. For God's sake, Carter had never imagined himself in this kind of situation. A part of him wanted to turn the car around, to admit he had made a mistake. The dispatch had made it clear that Jonathan wasn't the suspect they were after. But pride, combined with years of ingrained prejudice, held him firm in his decision. To back down now would mean admitting failure, and that wasn't something Carter could easily accept. As they drove, Carter could feel the tension building. He glanced at Jonathan through the rearview mirror, his mind still trying to process everything. He knew people were watching. The civilians who had started filming the arrest would no doubt post the footage online within minutes. Word would spread fast. There was no way this would stay under wraps. A part of him feared the backlash, but another part was defiant. He had followed his instincts, and his instincts had never steered him wrong before. Jonathan, meanwhile, tried to focus on keeping his breathing steady. Every nerve in his body was on edge. The weight of the situation, the sheer absurdity of it all, pressed down on him like a vice. His thoughts were a whirlwind of anger, disbelief, and helplessness. He thought about his family, his wife, his children. What would they think when they found out about this? The humiliation of it all was almost too much to bear. His mind drifted back to the moments just before the arrest, to Carter's eyes, the unwavering certainty in them. There had been no reasoning with the officer, no point in explaining. Once Carter had drawn his gun, everything had been set in motion, and Jonathan had known, in that moment, that there was no escaping what was to come. The frustration he had felt while walking through the neglected streets now boiled over into a deep, simmering rage. He had come to this neighborhood to help, to see the problems for himself, and instead, he had become a victim of the very issues he had promised to fight. How had it come to this? The car pulled into the parking lot of the precinct, and Jonathan felt a jolt of reality. This was happening. He was about to be processed like any other criminal, booked and thrown into a holding cell. He tried to keep his composure, reminding himself that this wouldn't last forever. He was the mayor. Eventually, the truth would come out, and this nightmare would end. But in the pit of his stomach, he couldn't shake the feeling that the damage had already been done. Carter parked the car and stepped out, his movements rigid and mechanical. He opened the back door and motioned for Jonathan to step out. "Let's go," he muttered, not meeting Jonathan's eyes. Jonathan complied, stepping out of the car as gracefully as he could with his wrists still bound behind him. The precinct was a cold, sterile place, its fluorescent lights casting a harsh glare over everything. The smell of disinfectant hung heavy in the air, mixed with the faint scent of sweat and fear. The sounds of muffled conversations, clinking handcuffs, and the distant buzz of phones created a constant hum of activity. For Jonathan, it was surreal. He had visited precincts before, but always as the mayor, always in a position of authority. Now, he was just another detainee. Carter led him through the entrance, ignoring the sideways glances from his colleagues. They all knew who Jonathan was. Some of them exchanged looks, their eyebrows raised in silent questions, but none of them dared to speak up. It wasn't every day that the mayor of the city was brought in handcuffed like a common criminal. The tension in the room was palpable. The desk sergeant, a grizzled man with a thick mustache, glanced up as Carter approached with Jonathan in tow. His eyes widened slightly in recognition. "What the hell is this?" he asked, his voice low and gruff. Carter shrugged, trying to maintain his composure. "Picked him up in the Bronx. Fit the description of a suspect we're looking for." His voice was flat, almost defensive. The sergeant's eyes flicked between Jonathan and Carter, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. "You sure about this, Carter?" "That's the damn mayor." Carter felt a flicker of doubt but quickly squashed it. He didn't have any ID on him, he lied, his voice hardening, and he was acting suspicious. "We'll sort it out once we get him processed." Jonathan, hearing the blatant lie, felt a surge of anger. "I showed you my ID," he said, his voice calm but laced with frustration. "You chose to ignore it." Carter shot him a cold look but said nothing. The sergeant, sensing the tension, gave a reluctant nod. "All right. Get him processed, but you better be sure about this, Carter. You screw this up, and it's not just your ass on the line." Carter nodded curtly and led Jonathan toward the processing area. As they walked, Jonathan could feel the eyes of every officer and civilian on him. The weight of their stares was suffocating. He tried to keep his head held high, but the humiliation was overwhelming. He had spent his life fighting for justice, for equality, and now he was being treated like a criminal in the very system he had sworn to reform. In the processing area, a young officer with wide, uncertain eyes approached them. "We're booking him," he asked, glancing nervously at Jonathan. Yeah, Carter snapped, his patience wearing thin. Let's get this over with. The officer hesitated for a moment before nodding and stepping forward. Name? He asked, his voice shaky. Jonathan looked the young officer in the eye. Jonathan Reed. The officer blinked in recognition, his face paling slightly. The mayor? That's right, Jonathan replied, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling inside him. The officer glanced at Carter, clearly unsure of what to do. Carter's expression remained stony. Just follow procedure, he said, his tone brooking no argument. With shaky hands, the young officer proceeded to take Jonathan's fingerprints, the ink cold against his skin. The entire process felt like an out-of-body experience, as if Jonathan were watching someone else go through this ordeal. It was surreal, humiliating, and deeply wrong. But he remained silent, knowing that any protest would fall on deaf ears. Carter had already made up his mind, and now Jonathan was at the mercy of the system. Once the processing was complete, Carter led Jonathan toward the holding cells. The metallic clanging of the cell doors echoed in Jonathan's ears as they approached. The air was thick with the stench of sweat and stale breath, the murmur of low conversations filtering through the narrow corridors. The holding cells were a grim place, filled with the forgotten, the desperate, and the guilty. Carter opened one of the cell doors, gesturing for Jonathan to step inside. Jonathan, for a moment, his eyes locking with Carter's. There was no point in arguing. He had already tried reasoning with the officer, and it had gotten him nowhere. Slowly he stepped into the cold, cramped cell, the door slamming shut behind him with a deafening clang. As the sound of the door echoed through the cell block, Jonathan sat down on the narrow bench, his head in his hands. He had never felt so powerless. This was supposed to be his city, his administration, but tonight, none of that mattered. Tonight, he was just another black man in a holding cell, waiting for anyone to come to his defense. Meanwhile, Carter stood outside the cell, his hand still gripping the bars as he watched Jonathan. Doubts began to creep into his mind, but he shoved them aside. He had followed protocol, he told himself. He had done his job. And yet, a small voice inside him whispered that maybe he had made a mistake, but there was no going back now. The wheels were already in motion. Hours passed, and Jonathan remained in the cell, the minutes dragging on like hours. His mind wandered back to his family, to his wife and children. How would they react when they heard about this? How would the media spin this story? He could already see the headlines, Mayor arrested in wrongful detainment. The thought of it made him sick. Then, without warning, the door to the holding area swung open. A tall man in a sharp suit entered, his face set in a grim expression. He was one of Jonathan's closest advisors, a man who had been with him since the start of his political career. Jonathan, he said quietly, his voice tinged with disbelief. What the hell happened? Jonathan stood up, his relief at seeing a familiar face almost overwhelming. I got arrested, he said simply, the exhaustion in his voice evident. I know, the man replied, glancing at Carter, who was standing off to the side, arms crossed defensively. We're working on getting you out of here. This is a nightmare. Jonathan nodded, though the anger and frustration still simmered beneath the surface. It's more than a nightmare, he muttered, his voice low. This is exactly what I've been fighting against, and now I'm the one sitting in a cell. The man sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. We'll deal with it, Jonathan. Just sit tight a little longer. We're pulling every string we can. As his advisor left the room, Jonathan sat back down on the bench, the weight of the night settling heavily on his shoulders. He knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. Jonathan sat alone in the cold, dimly lit cell, the quiet punctuated only by the occasional distant sound of footsteps or muffled voices from officers passing through the precinct. Hours had passed, yet each tick of time felt like an eternity. The weight of the situation pressed heavily on his shoulders, and though outwardly calm, his thoughts were racing. The reality of his detainment as mayor and elected leader of the city was unfathomable, yet it had happened. This was a harsh reminder of the systemic racism he had fought so hard against, now playing out against him in the most personal way possible. The irony of it stung. He tried to keep his mind focused, knowing that his team would be doing everything in their power to secure his release. But even if this nightmare ended soon, the damage had already been done. The public arrest, the handcuffs, the murmurs and stares, it was all captured on camera, shared through social media, and likely already making waves in the press. His reputation, carefully built over years of hard work, was under threat. He was no longer just Jonathan Reed, mayor of the city, but now a symbol of injustice, a victim of the very prejudice he had vowed to dismantle. The thought of how his arrest would be spun in the media was suffocating. Suddenly, the door at the end of the cell block creaked open, and Officer Michael Carter stepped inside. Jonathan's eyes flickered up, catching the officer's stern gaze. Carter walked with a sense of determination, but there was an underlying tension in his movements. Jonathan could see it, the slight tremor in Carter's jaw, the way his eyes darted around the room as if trying to avoid direct contact. Something was wrong. Carter unlocked the cell door with a metallic clang, stepping aside as another man entered. This man was dressed in an expensive suit, his face sharp and cold. Jonathan didn't recognize him, but there was an air of authority around him that made the mayor immediately wary. "Jonathan Reed," the man said, his voice smooth but devoid of warmth. "I'm Victor Morgan. I represent certain interests in this city, and we need to have a conversation." Jonathan's brow furrowed. He didn't like the way this was starting, nor did he appreciate being addressed as though he were a common criminal. "I'm the mayor of this city," Jonathan replied firmly, straightening up on the bench. "I don't take kindly to being treated like this. What is this about?" Morgan smiled thinly, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. He stepped closer, his polished shoes echoing against the concrete floor. "You're in quite the predicament, Mr. Reed, and while I'm sure your staff is working on your release as we speak, I'm afraid your problems go much deeper than a simple misunderstanding with the police." Jonathan's stomach twisted. He could sense the shift in the conversation, the sinister undertones lurking behind Morgan's words. This wasn't just about the arrest, it was something bigger, more orchestrated. "What do you want?" Jonathan asked, his voice low, controlled. Morgan glanced at Carter, who stood silently by the cell door, his face tight with tension. "Officer Carter here made a mistake, I'm sure," Morgan continued, his voice measured. "But that mistake has opened a door, one that could be very useful to certain parties who want you out of the picture." Jonathan's heart began to pound in his chest. He had anticipated opposition from his political rivals, but this was something else entirely. The calm veneer he had maintained throughout the night began to crack as he realized the depth of the situation. "So what are you saying?" he asked slowly, though he already feared the answer. Morgan's smile widened, but it remained cold, calculating. "What I'm saying, Mr. Reed, is that there are people in this city who would prefer if you weren't in office anymore. Your policies, your so-called reforms, let's just say they've upset the wrong people, powerful people." Jonathan's mind raced as he processed the implications of Morgan's words. He had always known that his fight to reform the city would make enemies, particularly among those who profited from the corruption he was trying to dismantle. But this was more than just political opposition. This was an orchestrated attack to remove him from power. His arrest wasn't just an unfortunate incident. It was a calculated move, part of a larger plan to destroy his credibility. "You're making a mistake," Jonathan said, his voice firm but edged with anger. "If you think you can intimidate me, you're wrong. I won't back down from this fight." Morgan chuckled softly, the sound chilling in its indifference. "This isn't about intimidation, Mr. Reed. It's about reality. The reality is that you've made too many enemies, and they've decided it's time for you to go. This arrest is just the beginning. We have the means to ensure that your reputation is completely destroyed. You'll be lucky if you ever hold office again if you're not to steer." Jonathan's hands clenched into fists at his sides. The rage boiling within him threatened to spill over, but he forced himself to remain calm, to think strategically. He had to figure out what exactly Morgan wanted, and more importantly, how to stop him. "What do you want from me?" Jonathan asked, his voice low and dangerous. "What's the point of all this?" Morgan's smile faded, replaced by a cold, calculating expression. "What we want, Mr. Reed, is for you to quietly step down. Resign from your position, make a public statement about your inability to lead, and disappear from the political arena. Do that, and this arrest, this unfortunate incident, will disappear as well. Refuse, and we'll ensure that this arrest is just the first of many blows to your career. We have people in the right places, officers willing to fabricate whatever charges we need, and judges who will happily make them stick. You won't just lose your career, you'll lose your freedom." The weight of Morgan's threat hit Jonathan like a freight train. The sheer audacity, the corruption that ran so deep, left him momentarily speechless. This wasn't just about his political career, this was about his life, his freedom and the future of the city he had fought so hard to protect. Jonathan took a deep breath, forcing himself to think clearly. He couldn't show fear, couldn't let Morgan see how much the threat had rattled him. "You're a coward," Jonathan said quietly, his voice steady despite the fury simmering beneath the surface. "You and the people you represent are afraid of change, afraid of losing the power you've built on the backs of the people in this city. But I won't give you what you want. I won't step down, and I sure as hell won't let you ruin everything I've fought for." Morgan's eyes darkened, his smile fading completely. "You're making a mistake, Mr. Reed," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "I hoped you would be smart about this, but it seems you'd rather be a martyr than a leader." Jonathan stood his ground, his eyes locked on Morgan's. "I'd rather fight for what's right than be bullied into submission. You can throw whatever you want at me, but I won't back down." Morgan's lips curled into a sneer. "We'll see about that." With that, Morgan turned on his heel and walked out of the cell, leaving Jonathan standing there, the weight of the threat hanging in the air. Carter, who had been silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke, his voice tight with barely restrained frustration. "You just made your life a hell of a lot harder," Carter muttered, his eyes hard as he locked the cell door behind Morgan. Jonathan glanced at Carter, his expression one of steely resolve. "Maybe," he said quietly, "but at least I'm not a coward." Carter's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, walking away and leaving Jonathan alone in the cell once again. Jonathan sat back down on the bench, his mind racing. The conversation with Morgan had confirmed his worst fears. His arrest had been planned, and now he was caught in a web of corruption that ran deeper than he had ever imagined. But despite the gravity of the situation, Jonathan refused to let fear dictate his actions. He wasn't going to let these people bully him into submission. If they thought they could scare him into stepping down, they were wrong. He had fought too hard for this city, for its people, to give up now. He would find a way out of this, no matter what it took, and when he did, he would expose every last one of them for what they were: corrupt, power-hungry cowards hiding behind their wealth and influence. Hours passed, and Jonathan remained in the cell, his resolve hardening with each passing minute. He knew his team was working on his release, But he also knew that his enemies were working just as hard to keep him locked up, to destroy his credibility before he could fight back. The stakes were higher than ever, but Jonathan had never been one to back down from a fight. Finally, the door to the holding area swung open once again, and Jonathan's advisor reappeared, his expression grim. "We've secured your release," he said quietly. "But there's more. The press is already all over this, and they're spinning it every which way. We need to get you out of here and into a safe place where we can regroup." Jonathan nodded, standing up and stretching his stiff limbs. He was exhausted physically and emotionally, but he wasn't beaten. Not yet. "Let's go," he said, his voice firm. As they left the precinct, the cold night air hit Jonathan's face, and he took a deep breath. The battle was far from over, but he was ready for whatever came next. As Jonathan exited the precinct, the harsh glare of streetlights and the distant hum of the city enveloped him. The crisp night air felt like a strange contrast to the suffocating tension he had experienced inside the holding cell. He was free for now, but the weight of everything he had just learned, the sinister plotting by those in power, and the fact that his arrest had been orchestrated gnawed at his mind. His advisor, Jacob, led him to a waiting car, parked discreetly a few streets away from the station. The air between them was thick with unspoken tension. Jacob had filled Jonathan in on what little he could while they walked, but the situation was still precarious. The media was already having a field day, and though they managed to keep the mayor's release somewhat quiet for the moment, it wouldn't last. Jonathan could practically hear the ticking clock counting down until the public outrage and political backlash would explode. As they reached the car, Jacob turned to Jonathan, his face lined with worry. "You need to lay low for a while," Jacob said quietly, his eyes scanning the street, always on alert. "There's no telling what they'll do next, and until we have a solid plan, you're vulnerable." Jonathan leaned against the side of the car, running a hand over his face in frustration. "Lay low," he echoed, shaking his head. "You know I can't just disappear, Jacob. That's exactly what they want. If I go into hiding, it'll look like I'm guilty, like I'm running away. I need to confront this head on." "I understand that, but this is more than just a PR nightmare. These people are dangerous," Jonathan, Jacob insisted, his voice low but urgent. "They've already orchestrated your arrest. Who knows what they're planning next? If you make a wrong move, they'll bury you." Jonathan's jaw clenched as he thought about Victor Morgan's thinly veiled threats. He couldn't deny that Jacob was right. The people behind this plot were powerful, well-connected, and ruthless. They didn't just want him out of office, they wanted to destroy him completely. But despite the risks, Jonathan couldn't shake the feeling that hiding would be playing right into their hands. They had already set the trap, and they were waiting for him to stumble. "No," Jonathan said, his voice firm. "I'm not going to hide. I'm going to fight this, Jacob. We expose them. Every one of them. They think they can get away with this, but we'll show the public the truth. We'll expose the corruption." Jacob sighed, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "Do you realize how hard that's going to be? They have people in the right places, people who can manipulate the media, fabricate evidence. They're going to make it look like you're guilty, no matter what the truth is." Jonathan knew Jacob was right, but the alternative, walking away from everything he had fought for, was unthinkable. "We'll find a way," he said, though he wasn't sure if he was trying to convince Jacob or himself. "We have to." Before Jacob could respond, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He quickly pulled it out, his brow furrowing as he read the message on the screen. "Shit," he muttered under his breath. "What is it?" Jonathan asked, his heart skipping a beat. Jacob looked up, his expression dark. "It's already starting. One of the news outlets just got a hold of the arrest footage. They're spinning it to make you look like a suspect in some criminal activity. It's all over social media." Jonathan felt his stomach drop. What are they saying? They're claiming that you were acting suspiciously in the neighborhood, that the police had reason to believe you were involved in a recent string of robberies. Jacob explained, his voice grim. They're using your arrest to paint you as untrustworthy, implying that there's more to the story. Jonathan's anger flared. They're framing me just like Morgan said they would, he growled. They want to make me look like a criminal, so I have no choice but to resign. Jacob nodded. And it's working. Public opinion is already starting to turn. Some people are questioning the arrest, but others, they're buying into the narrative that you were involved in something shady. Jonathan clenched his fists at his sides, the rage simmering just beneath the surface. This is exactly what they want, he said through gritted teeth. To discredit me, to make me look like I don't belong in office. They're playing on people's worst fears and biases. Jacob sighed again, glancing around the empty street as if expecting someone to jump out from the shadows. What do we do now? Jonathan straightened, his resolve hardening. We fight back, he said firmly. We go public with the truth before they can spread any more lies. I'll call a press conference, address the public directly. I'll tell them exactly what happened tonight. Jacob looked hesitant. Are you sure that's a good idea? If we don't have concrete evidence to back up your claims, it could make things worse. Jonathan's eyes burned with determination. I have nothing to hide, Jacob. They want to take me down because I'm a threat to their corrupt system. I won't give them the satisfaction of staying silent. Jacob nodded, though he still seemed unsure. All right, he said after a moment, but we'll need to be strategic about it. We can't just go in blind. Jonathan agreed, but his mind was already racing with how to confront this situation. He wasn't going to sit idly by while corrupt forces tried to tear him down. They may have set the first trap, but he wouldn't let them dictate how this ended. Back at his home later that night, Jonathan sat in his study, the warm glow of the desk lamp casting long shadows across the room. He had only just begun to unwind when his phone buzzed on the desk. It was a message from an unknown number. You should have listened to Morgan. Step down, or we'll make sure your family pays the price. Jonathan's blood ran cold as he stared at the message. This was no longer just a political attack, this was a direct threat against his family. The thought of his wife and children being dragged into this battle made his hands tremble with rage. He couldn't allow them to be used as pawns in this sick game. His mind raced as he considered his next move. This was bigger than him now. It was about protecting the people he loved. Without hesitation, Jonathan dialed Jacob's number. We need to escalate this, he said the moment Jacob picked up. What do you mean? Jacob asked, his voice tense. They're threatening my family now, Jonathan explained, his voice hard. This is no longer just about me. We need to bring in the big guns. I'm calling in every favor, every connection I have. I need protection for my family, and I need it now. Jacob didn't hesitate. I'll make the calls. But Jonathan, this is getting dangerous. You need to be careful. I know, Jonathan said quietly. But I'm not backing down. I can't. The next morning, Jonathan's resolve had only grown stronger. He stood at the podium in the press room of City Hall, the bright lights of the cameras trained on him. His heart pounded in his chest as he looked out at the sea of reporters, their pens poised and ready to document every word he said. Jacob had advised caution, but Jonathan knew that this was his moment to take control of the narrative. If he didn't act now, the lies would only spread further, and the people who wanted him gone would win. Taking a deep breath, Jonathan began to speak. Last night I was wrongfully detained by the police while visiting one of our city's most neglected neighborhoods, he said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. I was treated as a criminal, despite identifying myself as the mayor of this city. This is not an isolated incident, it is part of a broader attempt by corrupt individuals to discredit me and my administration. The reporters scribbled furiously as Jonathan continued. Let me be clear, I will not be intimidated, I will not step down, and I will not allow these corrupt forces to undermine the progress we've made in this city. I have fought for transparency, for justice, and for equality, and I will continue to fight, no matter what threats are made against me or my family. There was a murmur among the reporters as they digested Jonathan's words. The room was tense, the weight of the mayor's statement hanging in the air like a storm cloud. I will not be silenced, Jonathan continued, his voice rising with passion. I am calling for an independent investigation into the circumstances of my arrest, and I will work tirelessly to expose those responsible for this conspiracy against me. This is not just about me, this is about all of us. It's about the kind of city we want to live in, a city that is fair, just, and free from corruption. As Jonathan finished speaking, the room erupted into a frenzy of questions, the reporters shouting over one another in their eagerness to get a response. But Jonathan held up a hand, silencing them. For I've said all I need to say, he said firmly. Now it's time for action. As he stepped away from the podium, Jacob met him backstage, his expression a mixture of relief and concern. That was risky, Jacob said quietly. But I think it worked. Jonathan nodded, though he knew that the real battle was just beginning. The press conference was only the first step in what would be a long, difficult fight. The forces arrayed against him were powerful, and they wouldn't back down easily. But neither would he. Later that night, Jonathan sat in his living room, surrounded by the quiet comfort of his home. His wife sat beside him, her hand resting gently on his knee, offering silent support. Despite the chaos swirling around them, this moment of peace felt like a small victory. But the peace didn't last long. Jonathan's phone buzzed once again, and as he glanced at the screen, his heart sank. It was another message from the same unknown number. You should have walked away. Now it's too late. Jonathan's chest tightened as he stared at the words. He had expected retaliation, but the directness of the threat sent a chill down his spine. They weren't just trying to scare him anymore, they were making it clear that they were willing to go further, much further, to get what they wanted. Without a word, Jonathan stood and walked to the window, staring out into the night. He knew he was standing on the edge of something dangerous, something that could destroy everything he had worked for. But even as the darkness pressed in around him, Jonathan Reed made a silent vow to himself. He wouldn't let them win. The threats had been escalating, and Jonathan could feel the noose tightening around him. But instead of retreating, he pressed forward with renewed determination. He had called in favors, leaned on eyes, and gathered evidence wherever he could. The fight had become personal, not just for him, but for the very soul of the city. Corruption had seeped deep into the roots of power, and Jonathan knew that if he didn't confront it head-on, the city would never recover. Days after his press conference, the city was in a state of unease. Protests had erupted outside City Hall, with crowds demanding transparency and justice. Some called for Jonathan to step down, their voices echoing the smear campaign orchestrated by his enemies. Others rallied behind him, chanting for an end to the corruption that had plagued the city for years. The divide was palpable, and the air was thick with tension. Jonathan sat in his office, going over the latest developments with Jacob and his legal team. They had managed to gather some critical evidence, emails, phone records, and financial statements linking Victor Morgan and several high-ranking officials to the conspiracy against Jonathan. But there was still one piece of the puzzle missing, one crucial bit of evidence that could blow the whole thing wide open. We need more, Jacob said, pacing the room. Morgan's people are going to bury us if we don't have concrete proof. Right now, all we have are breadcrumbs, It's enough to suggest corruption, but not enough to take them down. Jonathan nodded, his mind racing. He knew they were close, but they couldn't afford to misstep. What about Carter? He asked, his voice steady but laced with tension. He's the one who arrested me. He knows more than he's letting me on. Jacob stopped pacing and looked at Jonathan. Carter's dirty, no question. But getting him to talk, that's going to be nearly impossible. He's loyal to Morgan, and he's already doubled down on the story that you were acting suspiciously that night. Jonathan's eyes narrowed. Everyone has a breaking point. We just need to find his. Before they could continue, there was a knock at the door. One of Jonathan's security personnel stepped in, his expression serious. Mr. Mayor, Officer Carter is here. He says he wants to talk to you. Alone. Jonathan exchanged a look with Jacob, both of them surprised. Carter had been part of the problem from the beginning, loyal to the corrupt forces trying to take Jonathan down, but now he was here, asking to meet privately. Jonathan couldn't help but feel a mix of suspicion and hope. Was this the break they needed? Let him in, Jonathan said, his voice calm but firm. A few moments later, Michael Carter stepped into the office, his face pale, his eyes filled with unease. He looked different than the defiant officer who had wrongfully arrested Jonathan. Now there was a heaviness in his posture, a weight on his shoulders that hadn't been there before. Jonathan gestured to the chair opposite his desk. Sit, he said, watching Carter closely. The air between them crackled with tension as Carter lowered himself into the chair. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched on, thick and uncomfortable, until finally Carter broke it. I messed up, Carter said quietly, his voice barely audible. Jonathan leaned forward slightly, his eyes locked on Carter. You did more than mess up. You tried to destroy me. You were part of a plan to take me down. So, why are you here now? Carter swallowed hard, his hands trembling as they rested on his knees. I didn't know how far it would go, he admitted, his voice shaky. I thought I was just doing my job. Morgan, he convinced me that you were a threat, that you were corrupt, but now I see what's really going on, and I can't live with it anymore. Jonathan's eyes narrowed, but he didn't interrupt. He wanted to hear everything Carter had to say. I've been part of this system for too long, Carter continued, his voice breaking. I've seen things, done things I'm not proud of. But this, framing the mayor, threatening his family, I can't be part of that anymore. It's gone too far. Jonathan's heart raced, but he forced himself to remain calm. Why now? He asked quietly. Why come to me now, after everything? Carter hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor. I didn't realize how deep it went, he said. Morgan and his people. They've got connections everywhere. They're willing to do whatever it takes to keep their power, and they don't care who they hurt. When I heard about the threats to your family, I knew I had to come clean. Jonathan's fists clenched at the mention of his family, but he kept his voice steady. So, what do you want from me? Carter looked up, his eyes filled with desperation. I'll give you everything I know, names, dates, documents, that can help you bring them down. But in return, I need protection. Morgan's people will kill me if they find out I've flipped. Jonathan sat back, considering Carter's offer. It was a risk trusting the very man who had been part of the plot to ruin him. But if Carter was telling the truth, this could be the evidence they needed to expose the entire conspiracy. This was the break they had been waiting for. All right, Jonathan said after a long pause. You'll get protection, but I need everything you've got, and I need it now. Carter nodded, relief flooding his face. I'll give you everything, he promised. I just want out of this nightmare. Jonathan nodded, but there was no satisfaction in his expression. He knew that this was just the beginning. The real fight was about to begin, and now, with Carter's testimony, they had a chance to take down the people who had orchestrated this entire plot. As Carter left the office, Jonathan turned to Jacob, who had been listening quietly from the corner of the room. "We've got him," Jonathan said, his voice filled with determination. "We've got them all." Jacob nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "It's not over yet, but this is a game changer." Jonathan exhaled slowly, the weight of the last few days pressing down on him. "Now we take the fight to them. We're going to expose every single one of them, and we're going to make sure they never have the chance to do this to anyone else." It wasn't the end. Not yet, but for the first time in days, Jonathan felt like the tide was turning. The storm was far from over, but he had weathered the worst of it. Now it was time to strike back. Jonathan could feel the energy in the courtroom the moment he stepped inside. The air was thick with tension, anticipation hanging like a weight on every person present. This wasn't just another trial, this was the moment the truth would finally come to light. The months of plotting, the threats, the corruption, it all led to this. The press filled the back rows, their cameras trained on him, while Morgan's supporters and detractors sat on opposite sides, barely containing their emotions. Some whispered amongst themselves, others sat in tense silence, waiting for the proceedings to begin. Jacob stood beside Jonathan, his expression grim but confident. They had worked tirelessly to gather the evidence needed to dismantle the conspiracy, and with Carter's testimony they had the final piece of the puzzle. Now all they needed was to present it and expose the corrupt network that had been operating in the shadows for so long. As Jonathan took his seat at the front, he glanced toward the prosecution's table. Victor Morgan sat there, his face an unreadable mask of arrogance and disdain. He didn't seem concerned, though Jonathan could see the faint signs of tension in the way Morgan's fingers tapped rhythmically against the desk. For months, Morgan had been the puppet master, pulling the strings to orchestrate Jonathan's downfall, and by all accounts, he had come close. But now Morgan's empire of lies and corruption was about to come crashing down. The judge entered the courtroom, and the buzz of conversation died down to a tense silence. Jonathan sat up straighter, his heart pounding in his chest. This was it, the final step in the long, painful journey he had been on since that fateful night of his arrest. Everything depended on what happened in the next few hours. As the trial began, Jonathan listened intently to the opening arguments. The prosecution tried to paint Jonathan as a corrupt politician, playing the same narrative they had been pushing in the media for months. But Jonathan knew that their case was built on lies, on fabricated evidence. They didn't have the truth on their side, and that was their greatest weakness. Finally, it was time for the defense to present their case. Jacob stood confidently, his voice steady as he outlined the conspiracy that had been orchestrated against Jonathan. He laid out the evidence they had gathered, connecting the dots between Morgan, corrupt officials, and the officers involved in the wrongful arrest. The courtroom was riveted as Jacob presented document after document, showing the payments, the secret meetings, and the lengths to which Morgan and his allies had gone to destroy Jonathan's career. But the most powerful moment came when Officer Michael Carter took the stand. Jonathan watched as Carter, visibly nervous, walked to the witness stand. He could see the strain in Carter's face, the weight of what he was about to do bearing down on him, but there was also a quiet determination in his eyes, a desire to right the wrongs he had been part of. Carter took a deep breath before speaking. "I was part of a plot to frame Mayor Reed," he admitted, his voice low but clear. "Victor Morgan and his associates convinced me that Reed was corrupt, that he was a threat to the city. I believed them. But now I see the truth. They used me to take him down, and I let them." The courtroom was silent, every eye trained on Carter as he continued. "I was ordered to arrest Mayor Reed that night, despite knowing he wasn't the suspect we were looking for. I followed orders because I thought I was doing the right thing. But I was wrong. It was all part of a larger plan to force him out of office. As Carter detailed the conspiracy, the weight of his testimony hit the room like a tidal wave. The jury, the judge, and the audience sat in stunned silence, absorbing the gravity of what was being revealed. Jonathan's heart raced as he listened, the final pieces of the puzzle falling into place. Carter's testimony was the nail in the coffin for Morgan and his corrupt network. When Carter finished, the prosecutor tried to discredit him, painting him as a disgruntled officer looking to save his own skin. But it was too late. The truth had been exposed, and no amount of cross-examination could undo the damage that had been done to Morgan's case. As the trial came to a close, the jury deliberated for what felt like an eternity. Jonathan sat in quiet anticipation, his hands clasped tightly together. He had done everything he could. Now it was up to the system to deliver justice. Finally, the jury returned, and the courtroom fell into a tense silence as the verdict was read aloud. We, the jury, find the defendant, Victor Morgan, guilty on all counts. A collective sigh of relief swept through the courtroom. Jonathan closed his eyes for a brief moment, the weight of the past few months finally lifting from his shoulders. Justice had been served. Morgan was led away in handcuffs, his arrogant facade. The corrupt officials who had conspired against Jonathan would follow soon after, each one facing their own trials and convictions. The web of corruption had been torn apart, piece by piece. After the verdict, Jonathan stood outside the courthouse, the cool breeze brushing against his face. Reporters swarmed around him, microphones thrust forward, questions flying. But Jonathan was calm, steady. He had weathered the storm and emerged on the other side. When the crowd finally parted, Jacob approached him, a proud smile on his face. "You did it?" he said, clapping Jonathan on the shoulder. Jonathan nodded, though his thoughts were still processing everything that had happened. "We did it," he corrected. "But this isn't just about me. This is about the city, about making sure this never happens again." Jacob nodded in agreement. "And it won't. You've changed the city, Jonathan. You've shown them that corruption can be beaten." As the sun began to set, Jonathan looked out over the city he had fought so hard to protect. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would always be challenges, always be people trying to undermine progress. But for now, he could take solace in knowing that justice had been served, and the city was one step closer to becoming the place he had always envisioned. He turned to Jacob, a determined gleam in his eyes. "The fight isn't over," he said quietly, "but we've won this battle, and we'll keep fighting for as long as it takes." Together they walked away from the courthouse, ready for whatever came next. Jonathan Reed was no longer just the mayor who had been wrongfully arrested. He was the man who had stood against corruption and won. And now he was more determined than ever to build a city that lived up to the promises he had made, a city that could finally begin to heal,